Laura, it's wonderful to have you back with us again. Laura and I have known each other for about 5 years or so, and she was a wonderful speaker at CU. She is a classmate of the two physicians I introduced to you a moment ago. Her degree is what's called a PharmD, a Doctor of Pharmacy. And Laura has specialized in women's health. She has studied the effect of cannabis use for lactating women, pregnant women. She has a large number of publications, and when I'm desperate for one of her slides, I call her up and say, "May I use your slide again?" And she's always been very kind in that regard. I'd like to say something personal about each speaker, and I know she knows one of the things I'm going to say. She has 3 sons, 9, 11, and 12.
I'm going to heaven.
Right. And she is rightfully proud of them. They're very athletic and play rugby and all the sports that you'd hope so. The other thing you don't know about her, I dare say, except for 2 colleagues at that table, is that she's a long-distance swimmer. And she's swum the English Channel, and she's swum the Tampa Bay the long way. And so she's a very well-rounded person and is going to talk to us about one of the most important things that we face today, which is the role of cannabis in medicine and possibly as alternatives to opiates for getting rid of opiate crisis. And in case you think this is a offbeat subject, consider that last year, the state of Colorado, just the state of Colorado, did $1 billion business in the fastest growing industry in our country, which is cannabis technology. And to put that in context, that's equivalent to all the residential home building in the state of Colorado. It's not a side deal. It's equivalent to all the grain growing in the state of Colorado. And so I'm not going to tell you about pharmacokinetics or any of that sort of thing, but she will. And so I want to welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. I'm grateful to Dr. Sievers for your guidance and wisdom through the years. I have to admit, I'm a walker and a hand talker, so I'm going to come down here and join you if that's okay. And I just want to say thank you for having me. This is a wonderful group. I'm excited to be talking with you. Just so you know, my plan here is to talk with you for about 15 minutes and get us warmed up, and then let 15 minutes be open question. And you'll probably get to know me fairly well in a short period of time to know that any question is okay with me. And if I don't know the answer, I will let you know that and I will get back to you. So I want it to be as open as you want it to be to get the questions that you have about cannabis. And I need you to understand that it was never my intention to be an expert in marijuana. That was not the path I was on. And Dr. Hess and Dr. Russo joined me here at AF Williams, and one day I'm sitting in clinic, and this is a great clinic because we have pharmacists and physicians and psychologists and nurses and PAs and social workers. It's very interdisciplinary. And so I'm sitting here doing my job as a clinical pharmacist, and my job was really to help our providers be better prescribers. So that's what I was doing as a pharmacist in that clinic. And one of our medical residents came in to the clinic, to our little precepting room, as we call it, to tell us about a patient who was breastfeeding her baby and smoking a joint per day. And I sat there in my chair thinking, okay, well, that's interesting. And then the resident said, and I told her that was completely fine. And I said to myself, I'm pretty sure that's wrong, but I don't know if it's right. And as any curious person would do, I started looking up information about the effect of cannabis on, in this case, breastfeeding, because women's health was my bag. That's what I was doing. And what I learned was that cannabis is a drug like a lot of other drugs with potential benefits and potential risks. And it surprised me. And when I went back to report to our team what I had found, that physician recommended me to give a talk at the Colorado Medical Society. I gave one talk, and I was the expert. And that is literally how it happened. And here I am now, 8 years later, and loving this journey. It's so interesting. And it's not interesting from the fact that bad things can happen, because they can. It's interesting from the fact that this is a drug we've had for over 5,000 years, and we're just beginning to learn about it. And I find that interesting. And some of that is because in our context of all of our lives, most of us have lived in a time of prohibition. So it just we haven't been exposed to it the way that other cultures and centuries of people have. So that's my story. I was left thinking, what do I do with this information? And pretty soon opportunities kept knocking and knocking. And I finally decided it's time for me to do what I do, which is educate. That's what I'm here to do for you today, is to help you understand what it is that's fascinating about this drug and what I'm concerned about with this drug, especially as a pharmacist, where I'm going to have some concerns. So with that, a couple disclosures. I don't have any financial relationships, but I wish I did. Dr. Sievers just indicated it's a billion-dollar industry. Hey, if I could have had a sliver of that, that would have been great. Obviously, I am talking about a completely illegal drug. It still remains illegal federally, and it's important for you to understand that. And because of that, what I'll be telling you are, right now, unapproved uses for this drug. So nothing is approved. And through this kind of walk and journey, I've actually had the pleasure and delight of serving on now 7 different task forces in our state. And in doing that, I've primarily tried to focus on patient safety. So if and when people decide they want to try or use cannabis, that they do so in an educated and informed manner, so they know what they're doing and how they're doing it. So I wanted to just cover 3 things today. What does it look like in our country? How might it work? And what am I concerned about? So this is how it looks in our country. And anything in a color besides gray is where it has been legalized. What do you notice? It is almost the entire country, with some form of either legalization or where you see decriminalization. The dark green indicates medical and recreational. The lighter green, different medical use or medical use with limited THC. And then the gray is completely decriminalized. But interestingly enough, I was really interested in what was happening in Nebraska, because we always get the rap for being a bad state, right? And what's interesting in Nebraska is that if you are found the very first time with marijuana, it is decriminalized to a civil offense. So that's why it's considered decriminalized there, but it still is illegal. But you can see here the entire country has swayed, and we are certainly in a sort of movement. And I don't know how the Fed's going to handle that ultimately, because it's something that we're going to have to deal with. Now, I also want to state a key opinion of mine, which is that I do think the considerations for medical use are different than recreational use. So in medical use, there is a need for someone to get help. They hurt, they're struggling, they're in pain, whatever it might be, they're dying. There is a benefit risk that I am going to assess. In the recreational context, when the intent is impairment, it's a different scenario for me. It is a risk, because when you are intentionally impairing yourself, bad things can happen. And I don't think every person looking to cannabis for medical use wants to be impaired. In fact, most people don't want to be impaired. And so we're trying to find this balance. And I'm putting that out there because I think that's, for me, an important differentiator about how I look at this. The last thing I'm going to add as my women's health caveat is that if someone is pregnant or breastfeeding, I don't think cannabis is a good idea. You have a developing brain in that, and I'll get into more of that I think is important to preserve. And so exposing a developing brain to cannabis is probably not the best idea. Okay, so with that aside, I'll kind of go into now what I think is more relevant from the medical side. And I want you to appreciate that marijuana is a complex plant. I want to say it's just a weed, right? Just a weed. On the other hand, it is full of interesting things. We have hundreds of cannabinoids. The one that you're the most familiar with is THC. Some of you have heard of CBD, CBN, a few other cannabinoids, over hundreds of cannabinoids in this plant. But there's also things like terpenes. Has anyone ever been to Red Rocks? Smelled anything at Red Rocks? Those are the terpenes. The terpenes of the plant, and often result in the name that we get, like a lemon skunk or a blueberry haze. Okay, much like wine, when you sniff your wine before you take your drink, there's actually a smell that we think has therapeutic properties in the plant from the terpenes. And then we have flavonoids and sterols and thiols and phenols, and they may or may not have as much of the therapeutic benefit. And then we get to something like a lipid property in this drug. That's important because that means it's going to go where? To your brain, which is full of fat. And in the breast milk, which is full of fat. And in other places in our body, which are full of fat. Okay, and when it does that, then it stays there for a longer time than something like alcohol, for example. Okay, so that's why that lipid property is really important. And then, of course, it's a fibrous material. Some of you actually may have hemp on you right now. Clothes or bags or ropes or whatever types of things are made from this substance. So it's quite diverse. I'm going to ask you a question. It's not meant to make you feel bad, just wondering where we're at. THC lands on receptors in the body. Which is a key target? How many of you would say CB1? CB7? PPAR? GPR 55? I have no idea. All right, well, we are here to learn something today. I've done my job and we're good. I'll just tell you now, the answer is 1, CB1. And I'm going to teach you about this a little bit. So how many of you have heard of the endogenous cannabinoid system? Okay, a couple of you who are experts already. You don't count. How many of you have heard the central nervous system? Okay, that's where we're going to start. Everyone has a central nervous system. Everyone has an endogenous cannabinoid system. And this system, just like the CNS, runs from head to toe. Now you're like, well, how come I've never heard of this? What are you talking about? I didn't have any idea. It actually wasn't discovered until the 1990s, the early 1990s. And the word is now getting out. Okay, this is a case where the drug was discovered and the molecules of the drug were discovered over 30 years before the system it impacted was discovered. That's unusual. Usually we have the system and we create the drug. In this case, we had the drug and now we're finding the system. So the system runs through our body from head to toes, brain, and all of our organs, and our peripheral tissues, and our skin, every single place, just like the CNS. And the goal of that system, just like the CNS, is balance. It wants to stay in balance. We call that homeostasis. Okay? So, much like when you get in a fight or flight response, we've all heard of that, right? The endogenous cannabinoid system will produce endocannabinoids to react to something. Okay? And in doing so, we have some receptors that are acting to accept the endocannabinoids. So I'm going to start with the endocannabinoids first. Our bodies make these substances on demand. It's called anandamide and 2-AG. Now, anandamide actually is a word that actually means kind of feel good or joyous feel. When we think of running a marathon and you're doing great, you've experienced what kind of rush? Endorphin rush, right? Wrong. It's actually anandamide. And it's giving you that little bit of that feel good. Okay? And it's because it's targeting different receptors in our body. CB1 receptors are really prominent in our brain. A lot of CB1 receptors in our brain. We also have CB1 receptors all over our entire central nervous system. We have CB2 receptors in our immune system, and we think that they're especially high in our gut. Okay, so I'm telling you this because what happens is when someone is needing a response to a metabolic or a, how can I say this, like it's somewhat like a glucose, sugar being produced when we need it, our body will produce anandamide or 2-AG when we need it. Okay, and then it will go to the receptors that it's needed. Now, anandamide looks a lot like what? THC. Anandamide is our endocannabinoid inside. THC is our exogenous cannabinoid outside. Here's the difference. THC is hundreds to thousands times more potent than anandamide. So instead of saying, oh, that felt great, that run was awesome, I say, whee! Are you with me? Okay? It's because most of us have an endocannabinoid system that is in balance, and when we land hundreds to thousands times more potent anandamide with THC on our body, we go flying. Okay, now, I promise this is the only ridiculous picture I have in this slide set, which is your synapse. This is what's happening in your neurons and in every part of your body where here you're seeing anandamide or 2-AG being produced based on a kind of response from a receptor. And my question to you comes then, what happens if there's a potential deficiency or a dysregulation in our endocannabinoid system? Now, let me just pull back for a second. If someone is depressed, what's missing or dysregulated? Serotonin. We heard of serotonin? Someone has Parkinson's disease. What's missing or dysregulated? Dopamine. Good. And if someone has Alzheimer's, what's missing or dysregulated? Acetylcholine. It's all you're like, oh yeah, I've heard of all these. Yes, we have conditions where deficiency or dysregulation is a part of how we treat it. My argument, my plight to you is we have other conditions that may exist where our endocannabinoid system is deficient or dysregulated. And a little bit of a very potent exogenous cannabinoid can go a long way to bringing us back into balance. Okay, so when we're talking about children with retractable seizures, we heard of these kids that are having hundreds or thousands of seizures daily, monthly, weekly, and we've tried 12 other medications, and now they have a 50% reduction in their seizures. No child at 2 years old is trying to have seizures, but there's an endocannabinoid dysregulation, we think. So a little bit of CBD, cannabidiol, can go a long way. Okay, so let me just give you a couple other examples. In our hypothalamus, if someone has a healthy system, what do you get in terms of appetite? The munchies. If someone has HIV-related cachexia, where their bodies just cannot produce or thrive the way they should, we give a little bit of, in that case, dronabinol or THC, and what happens? Their appetite increases. So what I'm arguing here is in the state of balance, there's an adverse effect. In the state of imbalance, we're bringing it into balance. Are you with me? Okay, likewise here, motor controller coordination. I've touched on the seizures already, but also we're seeing some evidence with tremor, Parkinson's disease, that maybe having that piece for a condition will help bring it back into balance. But if I'm healthy and I'm trying to slow my muscles down or my motor control down, what happens to me? Couch potato. Everything goes slow when I have my healthy function going, right? Now lastly, just as by sense of another example here is the cognitive functions. Okay? In a healthy person, what happens to their cognitive function? Right? Don't remember quite as well, really struggling, memory losses and very slow. I joke here in Colorado that people who are drunk drive through red lights. People who are high stop at green lights. Right? Just everything kind of slows down. However, now this is where it gets interesting because I'm sure many of you are wondering about this. What about in dementia? What about in Alzheimer's disease? We're getting more and more evidence, prominently in animals right now, but that a little bit of THC with maybe a bit more CBD could help neuroprotect. Because as we know through stages of life, we lose the ability over time. I'm not saying that all of us should run to the dispensary today. I'm just saying that I want you to understand how, in the context of health, it could be a side effect. In the context of illness, it could be helpful. And it's a different framework than I think we tend to talk about it. Just a little bit on CBD. It doesn't work quite the same way as THC, where there's a direct binding on the receptor. CBD doesn't seem to bind directly. In fact, it just suppresses the enzyme that breaks down anandamide. So by doing that, what's happening to my anandamide level? I'm bringing it up. Okay? And there's a whole lot of other effects that we think CBD will do, and I can get into that later. This point is just to show you that these chemicals are complex, and it's actually working in a lot of different systems within our body. Okay, so now I've convinced you it's awesome. Let me tell you why I'm concerned. There's a whole long list here, and each of these could be a whole other talk on its own. We have unintentional exposures where people are having edibles that they get left out, and children are consuming at higher amounts. Right? There's much more readily available. There are adverse effects that occur. As a pharmacist, I'm very concerned about drug interactions. This drug, like any other drug, can interact with other drugs. And we see that happening where it can alter the concentrations of other medications someone may be taking. Okay? There's the accuracy of education that gets provided. And if I'm a person coming into Colorado wanting to try this for something, who am I talking to as my healthcare expert? The bud tender, who might be a high school graduate, who might have a PhD in botany, but very rarely would be a doctor or a pharmacist or a nurse or a healthcare professional. Okay? The consistency we cannot guarantee from product to product, and along with that, the quality and purity of our products is in question, especially for people who want to order online. Very, very risky. And then the packaging, labeling, we've got some things that are required on our labels. Thankfully, we are now requiring testing here in Colorado for both not only the cannabinoids, but also pesticides and fungicides and things like that that might be used to grow the product. And then lastly, the content and contaminants, understanding what is in the product that we might want to consume. Okay? That was a quick drive with the cannabis. Now you know the CB1 receptor, right? Let me open it up now for all questions. And I just want to say, I will get to as many questions as Gary will allow me to answer, or whoever's in the time seat. However, I put my email, I had my email here. If you want to leave it there. I will be happy to respond to emails over the next week if you decide you've got a burning question for me, okay?
People who feel like they're out of balance in some way and could benefit from cannabis, who's the professional you go to if it's not the dispensary? And I'm guessing there are a lot of doctors who don't know enough about it. Right. What's the solution there?
So I think there are a couple. We have 2 doctors here sitting in the room that are, wanting to get into this as well, and I've trained with them, so I can vouch for their goodness. But besides that, I think that's what it is. It's seeing a healthcare professional who I would consider a cannabis provider. And we have several. There are a couple here in Boulder. There are some around the Denver metro area. And I think that's important because they are seeing patients day in, day out. Just like a heart surgeon, you'd want them to see heart patients all day in, day out, right? So I think that's a good place to start. And they can often provide really good recommendations about what would the right concentrations be, how much of THC, how much of CBD, or ideally, I'm not sure that cannabis is the best option for you. let's try to maximize this other thing that we might be trying first. Because if someone comes to me saying, I'm feeling out of balance, that can mean a lot of different things. And I'd want to learn much more about what does that mean to you. And if it's just that, well, I seem to like fall all the time, I'm not sure getting cannabis would be the right answer for that. If it's a different type of out of balance, then we'd want to talk about that. But I think going to a cannabis provider is key. Mm-hmm.
Like most people in this room, I grew up at a time when cannabis was referred to as a gateway drug. My question, and I'm a retired neurologist, is to know in what way research is being done now so that cannabis can become a kind of off-ramp drug for people who are already on opioids. The opioid epidemic is a much more severe problem right now.
Right.
Is the research being done to allow us to use this to help that out?
So there are now several observational studies that look at the use of opiates with cannabis. So right now they're mostly observational. There's not necessarily a side-by-side that I'm aware of at this point. However, in many of these studies, in most of these studies, they are reporting significant decreases in opioid use, and in addition to that, decreases in the number of medications that people are using overall. So the studies will range anywhere from 30 to 60% opioid reduction, which is quite significant. And the other thing that I think is important to acknowledge in this conversation is that you can die from cannabis. People always tell you can't die, but you can't die directly. You could jump out of a window because you are psychotic on cannabis. Okay, so that is an unintended consequence and an indirect death. With opiates, we die of respiratory depression. But there's not high concentration of CB1 or CB2 receptors in the brainstem where the respiratory center is. And that is why people are not dying from marijuana. Even if they overexpose themselves, they will not feel comfortable. It will be pretty awful in terms of feeling anxious, maybe a little bit psychotic, kind of crawling out of their skin feeling, but they will not die from it. And so I think it's posing a very interesting dilemma that we're going to have to face about as a complementary treatment for patients who are having pain. How do we do that? And I think one of the keys thus far has been that we're doing too much. People are dosing too high. They're overestimating what they need. And it's causing a kind of a different series of problems. But if we can start lower and go much slower, I think we'll have a much better result. So there is an addictive potential. Overall, the addictive potential is 9%, which is much lower than other substances that we have, of even alcohol, for example. I'm not saying that makes it okay. I am saying that I acknowledge it's an addictive substance, and we, as physicians, providers, pharmacists, need to be monitoring for that. Because we know, maybe here in Colorado, 9% or more of patients could become addicted. And yes, it's much less, also much less than opioids. Correct, and that's a good point to acknowledge, thank you. It's really the THC component, the psychoactive component, that's important. CBD is non-psychoactive. And now I think there's some of them working together, which can be helpful. However, it's really the THC that is the primary addictive component. Mm-hmm. Yes. So the question about Schedule 1 from the DEA, which means that there's no approved medical use and there's a high level of addiction or high potential for addiction. And there have been numerous pleas from even the American Medical Association, for example, to at least for research purposes, deschedule to Schedule 2. And it continues to be denied. There have been other efforts to deschedule through other veins that have been denied. I don't know where we're going to go with it. I understand how and why that could be, because think about this. If they deschedule to a Schedule 2, it now is a medication, and it will have to go through everyone's pharmacy. Now, I would argue that our horse is so far out of our barn, it's across the ocean and so over in Africa somewhere. Because we have recreational and medical, and now several states. So I think because of the speed and the rapidness of this movement, it's really causing a dilemma about how we go about this from a federal perspective. And at this point, the government has just said, we're going to let the states go one by one. And then I think along the way, they've tried to catch a few what I'll call bad actors to say, we're still watching, don't misbehave. And that's the way I'm seeing it so far. You've been patient, so I'm going to...
Quick question, because that federal funding of research, where is the quality research being done and how is it funded?
So here in Colorado, the CDPHE has done some work to be able to fund studies. Right now, there are currently 18 studies, 9 primarily focused in the therapeutic area, and 9 what I'll consider more public health related. And so, that's been okay. We'll start seeing results from those studies in the next year. So those have been ongoing for 3 to 5 years, but I can tell you being as a part of some of these study teams, it's really difficult with the funding. And then I think the other part of this is really saying we want more information so we can be informed about what we should use. We know there's potentials here. How can we do that? I think I will just say a place like this where many of you have influence and voices, now that you've gained maybe a better or different understanding, you just start asking more questions. How do I get to know more? We need the research. What can I do to encourage you to think about looking at this differently? And knowing and understanding the research and allowing people at the universities and other drug companies who do the research do it without so much restriction. So that would be my plea, is we can do more.
Laura, we here at Boulder Rotary get the last word.
Okay, fair enough.
And just to say we could go on, I'm sure the questions could go on for an hour. And Laura's generously agreed to, as we put her email with the synopsis that'll be in the rib next week, we'll put her email, so if you have any burning questions, you can actually ask her directly and get an answer.
Absolutely.
Okay? So thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
offering to do that.
Thank you.
So in your name, Laura, Boulder Rotary is pleased to contribute 100 doses of vaccine to our Polio Plus Fund.
Thank you.
Thank you
It's
so
going to make me
much.
cry. Thank you. It's awesome.
We went to a program last night at Anschutz that happened to talk about opioids, and we all left with a prescription bottle. So I brought you one, and I hope you can use it. It's the Chocolate Crisis Center prescription
Absolutely.
dark chocolate tablets. Take orally and savor when mood dips below optimum. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll definitely need these.